Hi people, it's Archivist here, hope you're doing well, and today I'm going to be reviewing Elden Ring. I wanted to wait until I completed the game, and after a long, almost 70-hour total playtime, I have finally beaten the game, defeated the main story boss. There is certainly more optional content for me to do, but this seemed like a good and practical time to review the game. The interesting thing about the story in Elden Ring is that it's not told to you in an entirely clear and straightforward way, to put it lightly. It's a game where I think there will be a lot of different interpretations on what exactly the narrative in this game is, or the branching narratives, because you can have some different quest lines which result in different endings. So you'll find NPCs throughout the world and you can talk to them, and they'll give you interesting nuggets of the overall world and the story, but often they themselves will be talking in what can sometimes seem like riddles. You're trying to understand what they're saying, but it's only through observing the world and also the text of items that you collect. So you might defeat an enemy, for example, and you will gain their armor later on. And if you go into the equip menu and you hover over their item and you select the option to switch to central view, you can see a description of the story behind that item. And if you look at all the different items and all the different lore text, you can begin to build a picture of what the story is and the background behind these different characters you encounter, so that you're almost creating this tapestry in your mind of all these different story beats, so that once you understand all of it, you'll be able to build the true narrative, the true story of this game. Now, I can say humbly that I do not fully understand what's going on in Elden Ring, and I look forward to the community unearthing the secrets and the stories of this game. The open-ended structure of the game is actually quite smart, because it means that for arguably years to come, people will continue to talk about the narrative in Elden Ring and what certain part means or what certain enemies represent. And it's a great way to just keep the conversation going. If you have a straightforward narrative that everyone interprets more or less the same way, then you'll have a conversation with someone about it. You'll talk about how much you enjoyed certain bits, but there isn't much back and forth because ultimately you and the other person saw it the same way. But in something that's more open-ended, two people might see the same story beat or the same environment and interpret it in very different ways, and that leads to conversation and debate, and that keeps the conversation going for much longer. So it's a smart way of doing storytelling. It's not necessarily the best way of doing storytelling or the worst way or an inferior way. It is simply an interesting alternative way of doing it. Not necessarily new to the Souls games, but the way that Elden Ring does it with its open world, offering so much in terms of what does this mean, and so much variety in terms of what does this mean. So story-wise, it may not be conventional, but Elden Ring is very strong. Moving on to the gameplay in Elden Ring, there is a lot of variety to be had here. At the beginning of the experience, you get to choose a class of sorts, although it's not pushing you into any kind of silo, any kind of hard commitment. It will influence where your strengths lie and your armor at the beginning of the game, but after that you can acquire new armor, you can allocate your points as you wish, and really build any kind of hero that you want to. I decided to go with the fairly uninteresting and safe Vagabond, because as someone who didn't really know what I was getting myself in for at the start of this, I knew it would be challenging, but I thought the best thing I could do was go for the safe pick at the start. And I'm glad I did, because I continued to follow the starting pattern of having heavy armor, a shield and a sword, so I was defensive, but I could still dish out some decent offensive capabilities. But something I noticed quite quickly whenever I would try to dodge out of the way of enemies is that my roll, which is essential for not getting hit by some of the heavier attacks, was very slow and cumbersome. So I removed some of the armor, and this allowed me to dodge in a far more agile and quick way, and with a lot more distance as well. And I noticed that the heavier the armor I wore was, the more resilience I had against attacks, but it also made me less agile. So if I was wearing ultra heavy armor with a really tough shield, sounds great on paper, but it means that you could just get repeatedly battered by an enemy because you don't have much capability to move out of the way. But then again, there is a attribute called endurance, and if you increase this, it makes your character able to dodge more freely even if they're wearing heavier armor. And it's this kind of complexity and balancing that makes the leveling system in this game something that becomes quite personal. You're not choosing the mage or the warrior or the rogue. You're mixing and matching these attributes and pushing them up as you feel you should be doing. And also, just to talk about the leveling in this game, if you're not really familiar with how it works in the Souls series, as you defeat enemies, you will acquire runes, and runes, when you go to a site of grace, and a site of grace is like a checkpoint in this game, you can spend these runes on leveling up. However, if you are to die when you're holding these runes, you will lose them, unless you're able to go back to where you previously died and you can literally pick them up again. However, if you fail to get back to that location and you die again, you will lose those runes permanently. So something you always want to be quite cautious about in this game is not going too long without spending your runes, because you don't want to risk losing multiple levels worth of runes. I mean, the sheer progress that can set you back if you're not careful is immense and can be very demoralizing if you do it. And what I like about this from a gameplay dynamics perspective is that it forces you to assess how confident you are in terms of moving forward. If you're going into an entirely new area and you're just shy of leveling up and you're continuing to move forward, you may, for all you know, encounter an enemy that could absolutely obliterate you. And if you're like me, who is fairly new to these games still, the only other one I've completed is Sekiro, I do walk the lands with some trepidation, because I know that there could be some very powerful enemy waiting around the corner to destroy me. And therefore you think to yourself, shall I keep going forward, keep progressing, or should I go back to the site of grace and bank my runes so that I don't lose them? And as you get further into the game, it takes longer and longer to level up because you need to give more runes. And so if you lose like 75% of a level worth of runes, that really can suck. So you are thinking in your mind, shall I be cautious and careful about this, even though it will of course take me longer to complete the game overall because I'm going back to my site of grace and banking it, or do I just want to rush ahead because I'm feeling confident? So it gives you this sense of like balancing. What do I want to do? Do I want to risk moving forward, or do I want to go back and cash in my runes? I was often on the side of caution. In terms of the game's pace, there is a slow and deliberate element, like a backbone to it, in that when you go for a strike with your weapon, for example, or you're casting a spell, you can't necessarily cancel out of it. You have to commit to doing that strike. And because you can't necessarily back out, the difficulty comes more from knowing, should I go for that strike? And it almost, at times in my mind, although obviously this is a real-time game, I was sometimes mentally processing it like a turn-based game. Like, if I go to strike now, will my opponent come and counter-attack and beat me, because I can't react to them attacking my attack. I have to know now, is this the right move? So you have to always be thinking ahead when you go to strike, because you won't necessarily get a chance to correct your mistake if you overextended yourself, if you attacked just one too many times. And this was something where, if I think of all the different bosses I faced in the game and think about the ones that I really did struggle with, it often came down to how obvious were their openings, that point where it was safe to go in for an attack. And there are definitely a couple of bosses where it's not necessarily super difficult to dodge their attacks if you memorize the patterns, but it can be hard to know exactly when they've stopped attacking. There's been a lot of times where an enemy, like, it really looks like they've got to the end of their combo, but then they do just one more strike and hit you. So you have to not just know the patterns of the attacks, but the variations of those patterns. And what can you get away with? Like, there were a lot of bosses where I could never go in for a heavy attack. There was just no way that would work. But that's when you start getting into the depths of all the different abilities you have. Like, the weapon I had, if I pressed the left trigger on my Xbox controller, I could use up some FP, which is like mana in this game, basically, I thought of it as. And then I can do a flip backwards and I can hit them really hard. And then if I do a heavy attack immediately afterwards, I can sort of spring forward and slash them. And there are all kinds of special abilities like this, which can add a lot of depth to the combat and can really dictate your playstyle. Like, that ability, is it like Bloodhound's Finesse or something to that effect? That really influenced how I fought a lot of the enemies in the game. And speaking of the weapons you can choose, you might find yourself, as I did, getting a weapon early on that you really like, and you can continue to upgrade it as you play so that it becomes viable right until the end. Like the weapon I got, that I'm using even in this gameplay, I acquired this before the first major boss, and yet through leveling it up, it was the weapon I used to defeat the final boss, and it's the weapon I'm using in this clip, right? So it's completely viable. If you find a weapon you're really attached to and you don't want to give it up, you don't necessarily have to. You can just keep using the blacksmith tools, the stones, to level up your weapon really high, and it can become continuously viable. And I do like that, because again, it means that if you find a weapon that you really resonate with, that you really enjoy, and it has a special ability you don't want to lose, you don't necessarily have to give it up. You just have to continuously invest in it. But you don't have to stick with it either. There's plenty of weapons in this game for different playstyles, so there's also a lot of options as well. Helping you traverse the large open world of Elden Ring is your steed Torrent, which you get very early on in your adventure. And it makes playing the game a lot more enjoyable in the open world, because you can get to places much easier, of course. But there are also, and this really surprised me, some honest-to-God platforming sections that involve the horse, where you need to use the double jump in order to get between small gaps and over locations. I really wasn't expecting platforming challenges in this game, but they genuinely are in here. And there's also some platforming just using your regular character, but it's more fun with Torrent because of the double jump. And then there's even combat with Torrent, where there'll be some monsters like dragons, for example, where I found that because they can move across the battlefield so quickly, it's often advantageous to have the steed so that you can chase after them and get out of the way of their deadly dragon breath. So Torrent does offer you some good options in terms of combat and, of course, traversal. And speaking of that open world, this is the big change, of course, for Elden Ring. What really differentiates it from the past Dark Souls, Bloodborne and Sekiro. So this is, I think, the greatest highlight of the game. The open world is large, it's expansive, imaginative, highly varied, lots of different biomes. Like, that's a big thing I always look for in these open world games, is are there multiple imaginative biomes? It's nothing worse than having an open world where it's just the same environment the whole way around, because you don't really feel like you're traversing or exploring this epic land. You feel like you're in one location, but that is absolutely not true of Elden Ring. It's super varied, and it incentivizes exploration just for seeing the world, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And on top of just the way the environment looks, the monsters themselves are so messed up, but in the best way possible. Like, they range from just being like your average soldier who's a little bit of a threat, to these crazy hand creatures. Like, they look like spiders, but they're just hands coming after you. Giant ants, which really freaked me out. Dragons, which are fantastically designed. Love the dragons, and there's multiple kinds of dragons as well. And the boss designs are, some of them, like, I both am in awe of how creative they are, but also slightly concerned for the mind who came up with them, especially when you see their mid boss fight animations when they maybe do a bit of a transformation. Some of them are a little unsettling, to say the least. But yeah, the world, just seeing the different creatures was such a big factor for me. Seeing, and there's a lot of variation. Like, not to say there's no repeating, there absolutely is, but I was so deep into the game and still seeing new monsters with completely different designs, and it really just, again, made me want to go forward and keep seeing, you know, these new creatures. And another big reason to explore the open world, beyond its simple beauty, is to gain power, so that you can stand against these bosses and defeat them a little more easily. You can go out and acquire runes so that you just become more powerful and level up, get great new weapons that you can use and enhance, temporary items which might give you a short-term but potent boost so that you are a little bit more powerful if it's only just for that boss fight, but it still might be worth doing. And then kind of essential stuff like you've got your flask, which you use to heal yourself, and you can increase the number of times you can use this per reset at a site of grace by getting these golden seeds. And it's really essential to do this early on if you can do it, because some bosses, even if you're pretty good at evading their attacks, they will just slowly whittle you down. And it's not too much of an issue if you can heal back up, but if you don't have many charges, then you'll just find it to be quite an overwhelming endurance test. So this was something I tried to do very early on, was give myself as many charges in my flask as possible. When it comes to the difficulty of Elden Ring, of course, a major talking point with any Souls game, well, having got to the end, I can say that it is, without question, a challenging game at times, sometimes truly testing your patience, but you can make most of the boss fights pretty manageable as long as you take the time to explore the open world. I found myself, wanting to go around the open world to see all of the different secrets, all of the imaginative monsters, but also because it would make me so much stronger. And then when I would return to a boss that maybe I was taking a break from, I'd find that I'd grown so much in strength that it was actually becoming quite manageable. Even things like these spirit ashes where you can summon these creatures to aid you in battle. One little thing, but it's something that can make an immense difference in combat. So if you want to go straight to the bosses, and the thing is, the game does kind of suggest you should do this, so I wouldn't blame anyone for doing it. I mean, I did it for myself initially, but if you just ignore that piece of advice that an NPC gives you, say, go straight for the castle. No, don't do that. Take a moment to go around the open world, power up, use the mini bosses almost as training materials so you can understand how, the mechanics of the game a little bit better, and then go to the boss and you will find it much easier to beat. It does mean, of course, that if you're someone looking for a more concise Souls experience, this might not be for you, and I might recommend Sekiro instead, which is a lot more focused, doesn't require you to deviate nearly as much. But if you are happy to explore a large open world and then use that to power up against enemies, well then, this game is definitely for you. Of course, you might be so good at this game that you don't need to do that. I'm completely aware of that as well, but I certainly wouldn't be up to that myself. I needed to power up a fair bit, especially for some of the tougher bosses. There is a social element to this game as well, although it does take the guise of a single player experience. You can leave messages in the world that other players can read, and you can read those messages, of course. You can decide to be helpful and say maybe there's an ambush ahead, for example. You can cryptically declare that this particular doorway cannot be traversed and you don't have the right to go through it, as I've seen a few times. You can just lie to someone and say, try jumping down the pit, and the thing is, there was one time it said that and you were supposed to do it, but I just stopped trusting it, so I didn't follow it. And that's the thing, like when you read these messages, you're like, do I believe this? And I got so skeptical towards the end that I just started thinking everything was like the opposite of whatever they said. But that's the interesting dynamic. You've also got these blood stains on the floor, and these will show the final moments of another player as they were trying to fight an enemy. I think there are also some blood stains which are there more to sort of just be flavour, but often it's another player. And this can be good to show you how they died, although you're only really seeing them, so I guess that's not too much of a help. But it does remind you, right, that if you're failing a bit at a certain point in the game, it acts as a reminder that, look, you're not alone in this. This is a challenging point in the game, and the bloodstains are showing you, yep, look, this is a hard point. Don't worry about it. You're not on your own. This is tricky. It's always a bit nerve-wracking when you go up to a door and it's just covered with bloodstains, because you know that whatever's inside is quite tough. If you want to take this even further, you can invade other players' worlds and be a bit mischievous, or if you're feeling a bit helpful, you can help someone to defeat a boss via co-op, or you can be helped yourself to defeat a boss via co-op. The only thing I'll say about this is that when you summon in someone else or multiple people to help you, like actual other players, it can take a boss that was previously really difficult and change it from not just manageable, but downright easy to beat. And it's something where, look, some people might want to play cooperatively more just because they want to play with their friends or whatever, just the playing together dynamic, but you don't necessarily want the boss to become a pushover as a result. Something I think I personally would have preferred is if the boss would aggressively scale based on the number of players that are fighting that boss. I don't think co-op should be like the skip button or the easy mode. I think co-op should be still a very challenging way to play that just so happens to have other players, because it is quite an epic spectacle to have these big bosses where you have all these different players working to take them down, but when that diminishes the challenge as much as it does in the boss that I chose to use against Commander Nile, because that went from a boss that I was really struggling with and I wanted to try out the co-op mode, but it just completely took away the difficulty. Like, we didn't have to work together at all. It just so happened that our combined damage and the fact the boss was split between us just made it easy. Like, it was, again, it was fun doing it, but I remember the boss dropped dead and I thought, I don't know, maybe I should have tried that myself. Maybe I should have persevered, because I don't really feel like I beat the boss, because it felt like we were working together, not even synchronized, and it was just too easy. And I feel like it's almost a bit of a contradiction, right, to the game overall. These Souls games, they're known as being really challenging and require a lot of perseverance and getting good, of course, to overcome. But that doesn't really work with me when there's a mode in the game or an ability, albeit with a finite item, to just diminish the challenge as significantly as it does. However, looking at the other side of the argument, the other side of the coin, if you are playing this as your first ever Souls game, and there is a lot to take in at once, just understanding what this game is asking of you can in its own right be quite difficult. And also the regular enemies, some of them are truly very strong, though, the non-boss enemies. So trying to overcome all of that and then the bosses as well, it can be a bit much, and it can be enough to make someone just not want to keep playing, right? You might just quit if there wasn't a way of getting around these really tough bosses. And the co-op mechanic does allow for that. It does allow for a brand new player to at least experience this game, see the open world. And this is the thing, like, I heard this recently, and it's a really good way of putting it. Although there is no actual easy mode in Elden Ring, this is kind of your easy mode, your get out of jail free card in terms of overcoming a boss. And I think that's a relatively smart way of doing it in terms of, how do you present a way of making the game more manageable for new players, but without explicitly saying this is the easy mode of Elden Ring, even though it kind of is. Graphically speaking, I'd say the game is a bit mixed, right? So artistically, it is beautiful, particularly in terms of the building architecture, which only gets better the more you play the game, trust me. And then there's also the monster designs, which are super imaginative and really well designed. But from a purely technical standpoint, the game does look like it's a bit dated. Maybe just not up to par with current gen games. I mean, it is a cross-gen game, but I don't know, I've seen other cross-gen games that look better than this. So what I hope will happen in the future is that FromSoft, they've really got the artistic side down. They know how to design a beautiful world. But in terms of the sophistication of their tech, they do need to do some catching up, I think. Well, I say need to, right? This game is wildly popular as it is. I would like them to try and catch up, because I think they almost owe it to themselves. If you look at what Bluepoint did with Demon's Souls, that is a combination of incredible art and incredible technical prowess. So, I mean, that's a really high bar with Bluepoint, but From Software, if they could get anywhere near that with their imagination as well, that would be a match made in heaven. When it comes to performance, I will speak briefly because I can only truly talk about the Xbox Series X. When it came out, I was not happy with the performance at all, but there was a patch, and since then, I would say that the frame rate in the game is pretty decent if I am using my VRR display. Because the game, at least by my eye, I'm not using a counter, but I'm estimating is fluctuating between 50 FPS and 60 FPS most of the time. VRR is great for that kind of fluctuation and really smooths it out to make it almost unnoticeable, or certainly just not an issue. But in order to do this recording with my capture card, I had to move it to my other display, which is not VRR enabled, and I could see what the game runs like raw. And this is how it will run for a lot of people, because VRR is still quite a niche technology. And here, it's not unplayable. I mean, you can see for yourself what it looks like, but it does have a noticeable element of bad frame pacing. So I really hope that this improves over time, the fact that they already patched the game and made it run better, gives me some hope that they could patch the game and make it better again, right? They just need to keep doing what they're doing. It might be that by the time you're hearing me say this, they have truly worked out all the kinks and it's working fine. So that's great. Apologies, I can't really speak to the other platforms because I'd just be giving you secondhand information I just want to speak to what I'm finding on the Xbox Series X. In terms of lasting appeal, the value for money, well, that's very strong with Elden Ring. The open world is humongous, and even if you manage to get to the end of the game, even if you see the credits rolled, there is still likely to be a lot left in the open world for you to do. And even if you do everything in the open world, you can always go into like a New Game Plus and do a repeat playthrough, try and master your skills against the bosses, and maybe you even want to start the game again and go for a completely different build. I mean, I feel like if I wanted to play the game again, it would be interesting to try it this time as more of a magic focused build, because it would be so different in terms of how it plays to what I've been doing in my in my game. So yeah, really strong in terms of value for money, worth every penny in my opinion. And then finally, the recommendation. Well, if you're a Souls fan, it's a no-brainer. The chances are you already own the game, so I don't hesitate at all to recommend it to any kind of Souls fan. Unless maybe the thing you liked about the Souls games was the fact that they were more focused and more deliberate. If you're someone who really can't stand the idea of an open world, maybe for you Elden Ring isn't quite worth it. In terms of someone who hasn't played this series before, I would say that it is worth trying it if you are willing to look at guides online. So I'm not necessarily saying literally boot the game up and then bring your laptop up and just follow a guide the whole way through. If you get to a point where you're struggling, don't get frustrated, don't necessarily quit, just go online, look at the wealth of resources there are out there for pretty much every aspect of the game, and see, is there anything you've missed? Is there an NPC I can summon? Is there a weapon that I missed that I could use to defeat this enemy? Be willing to accept help, because if you're not willing to accept help in this game, if you're brand new, I'd say you're destined to fail unless, you're just an ultimate natural, and if you are, well, I'm very jealous and, more power to you. So that is the end of my Elden Ring review. Thank you very much for listening, and feel free to ask me any questions or just share your opinion on the game in the comments below. As always, people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.